Do not let me hear of the wisdom of old men, but rather of their folly, their fear of fear and frenzy, their fear of possession, of belonging to another or to others or to God. The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 29. Jack's Bookshelf, T.S. Eliot. After Hours with Father Dwight Longenecker. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack. This season we've read through Perelandra, but this month we've been looking at Jack's bookshelf, at the authors and books which shaped his life and outlook. Today is our final episode of Jack's Bookshelf this season, and today we're looking at T.S. Eliot with returning guest Father Dwight Longenecker. Father Longenecker was brought up in an evangelical home in Pennsylvania. He graduated from Bob Jones University with a degree in speech and English, and he went to study theology at Oxford University. Eventually, he was ordained as an Anglican priest and served as a curate, a school chaplain in Cambridge, and a country parson on the small island just of the south of England, the Isle of Wight. After 10 years working as a freelance writer and charity worker, he returned to the United States and was ordained a Catholic priest. He now serves as pastor of Our Lady of the Rosary Church in Greenville, South Carolina. He is the author of many books, including The Gargoyle Code and Slubgrip Instructs, as well as the book which we'll be discussing today, Reluctant Allies, Essays on Eliot and the Inklings. Father Dwight Longenecker, welcome back to Pints with Jack.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Now, this is our second time recording. We had all kinds of technical gremlins the first time, but I'm feeling confident this time. Now, you were last on the show back in 2021 to talk about your Screwtape-inspired books, The Gargoyle Code and Slubgrip Instructs. What have you been up to since then?
Well, I completed my autobiography, which is called There and Back Again, A Somewhat Religious Odyssey, which tells the story of going from an evangelical home in Pennsylvania to Bob Jones over to Oxford, the home of C.S. Lewis, of course, and J.R.R. Tolkien, and becoming an Anglican priest, having a heavy dose of Anglophilia, the love of all things English, before coming into the Catholic Church and then returning to the USA. Thus, the title of the book, which I acknowledge is borrowed from the master, There and Back Again.
Well, today I'm drinking a nice large cup of Earl Grey tea. How about yourself?
Yeah, I've got some fruit juice here.
Wonderful. Cheers.
Cheers.
So this past month on Jack's Bookshelf, we've looked at Aristotle, Wordsworth, and Kenneth Grahame. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be wrapping up with T.S. Eliot, an American who made his way to England, so he had the complete opposite journey of me. So, Father Longenecker, who was Eliot? What are some of his basic biographical details, and where does he fit into the scheme of English literature?
Yeah, T.S. Eliot is an American born in St. Louis, Missouri, from a Unitarian family from New England. Now, the Unitarians are a particular sort of Protestant-type break-off from the Christian church, and they were very much formed by the pantheists and the utilitarians. So they denied the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, thus the name Unitarians, and basically turned Christianity into a sort of religion of respectability. And T.S. Eliot is brought up in this home. His grandfather was a Unitarian minister, and his relatives in the surroundings of Harvard in New England were all Unitarians. He's brought up in that environment, goes to Harvard to study, and was on the trajectory to probably be a philosophy professor. But he goes to Europe to study, ends up at Oxford for a year, and decides to settle in England. He marries an English woman, starts to earn a living, and starts to write his poetry, for which he's now famous. He was very much of the modernist school of poetry at the beginning of the 20th century, breaking all the conventional forms and writing in a very disjointed and in a very modern way. As such, wasn't really a great, C.S. Lewis wasn't really a great fan of his poetry.
Yeah, my wife and I, we've been reading Eliot at the breakfast table on Saturday mornings recently, and I was preparing for this month. I was also reading Wordsworth. I've got to say, I do much prefer Wordsworth. Eliot I found harder to navigate, But we'll get on to his poetry a little bit more in a moment. Would you mind us completing his religious arc? So he was raised Unitarian. What happened to him after that?
Even when he was an undergraduate at Harvard, he was reading all of the great spiritual masters, especially the mystics from 14th century England, the 14th century mystics, the mystics of other religions. He was reading St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila. He was reading the Bhagavad Gita. He was reading into Buddhism. So he was exploring the different religions of the world, especially their mystical and supernatural dimensions. Obviously, he was disenchanted with the rather boring religion of Unitarianism, which was really not much more than being respectable and being a nice person with a bit of sort of religious philosophy thrown in. So he's exploring all the different religions of the world. And then when he comes to England, he goes through the horrors of the First World War. And then in 1927, he decides to be baptized into the Anglican Church and into Christianity. And it's at this point that his life takes a new direction. His poetry takes a new direction, and he becomes an explicitly Christian writer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was he successful in his lifetime, or is this another case of an artist only truly being recognized after their death?
No, I mean, he was famous by 1927, with his groundbreaking work, The Wasteland, which is a monumental piece of work, and he became famous for that. He was already on the ascendant with his collection of poems based around Prufrock, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And so he was famous by the time he converted, and his fame only continued as he continued to write his Christian poetry. And eventually he branched off into writing drama as well, and was writing verse drama, all of it with strong Christian themes. So, however, his conversion to Christianity was controversial. Here he was hailed as the sort of poster child of the modernist movement, full of pessimism and nihilism and relativism. And then he converts to Christianity. And the other sort of leaders of the modernist movement, people like Virginia Woolf and the Bloomsbury set, castigated him for this conversion to Christianity. They couldn't believe that he had not only become a Christian, but had become a conservative Christian.
Am I right in saying there was somebody that said that he didn't become Catholic because he used all of his energies converting to being English?
Yeah, something like that. He had used up his reserves for conversion by becoming an Englishman.
There you go. There you go. And even though I'm technically now an American, I approve of conversion to becoming an Englishman. Now, when did you first come across T.S. Eliot, and what was it that got you hooked?
This is really kind of a weird story. I grew up in an evangelical home in Pennsylvania, as I've said before, and we had the World Book encyclopedias on the shelf. We had no television in our home, which is a great blessing because I read a lot. And I will remember in 1965, I was 9 years old, reading the World Book Encyclopedia Annual, which came out every January, and reading the obituary of T.S. Eliot. And I was intrigued by him, even at the age of 9. Here was a guy from America who went to England and lived in England and became a poet. And I thought, wow, that could be really cool to go in England and live in England and be a writer. And so, yeah, my interest in him began at that early age. I mean, while other boys were sort of playing little league baseball and, camping out and getting up to mischief, I was developing an interest in T.S. Eliot. How weird is that?
That's kind of weird, but, everyone has their own kind of weird that makes sense to them.
There we go.
So you first came across him from that source, but what were the first of his works that you actually read?
I think even at that young age, I was intrigued by England and, King Arthur and double-decker buses and Madame Tussauds. I can remember reading a children's book about a child who went to London and visited Madame Tussauds waxworks, and I thought that would be a fantastic thing to do. But first reading T.S. Eliot must have been when I finally got to college, and we read Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and his early poetry. I was an English major, so I was reading lots and lots of poetry and literature at the time, and Eliot was one of the ones. And then that early interest was captivated again by his actual work.
I can actually remember the very first piece of Eliot that I read. It was Macavity, the Mystery Cat. And then I
There we
later
go.
discovered that this was the basis for Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical. That blew my mind
Yeah,
when I
yeah.
finally connected those two.
And in fact, Eliot's widow became a very wealthy woman because, of course, she had a share in the whole cats phenomenon because she held the rights to Eliot's poetry and she sold the rights or shares to the rights. And so she had a steady income in her retirement.
Yeah. I wonder how Eliot would feel knowing that that was the thing that permeated popular culture years after his death.
You know, Eliot, like Wallace Stevens, earned his living as a clerk, first a bank clerk, and then an executive of a publishing house. So he was quick to say, "You'll never make very much money with poetry." But it turned out at least his widow did make a lot of money with poetry, his poetry.
Yeah. So can you just situate Eliot for us in terms of what would he himself have been reading? What would have been shaping him as he was beginning to write himself?
He's very much shaped by his reading in philosophy in his early years at Harvard, and as I said, by his reading in the mystical authors and the different spiritual traditions. But he's also very influenced by the French symbolist poets. They were active at this end of the 19th century, early 20th century. He was very influenced by their ideas and by their technique, and they very much influenced his writing because remember, he's writing as a modernist. He's very much an iconoclast. He's overturning all of the old conventions of English poetry, and so he's looking for new styles and new methods and new techniques and new ideas in poetry. And the symbolists were one of the things which really influenced him. I don't know how much you know about that particular strain of French poetry, but
absolutely nothing.
If you can think of the Impressionists as the artistic aspect, the painting side of it, the symbolists were very much doing the same sort of thing. The Impressionists were trying to, and the Post-Impressionists were trying to capture a feeling or an emotion for a particular experience, which they then were translating into visual imagery with their paintings. That's why the paintings are often kind of fuzzy and dreamlike. And the symbolist poets were doing a similar thing with poetry and language. And what they tried to do was to create a particular image through their poetry, which would be implanted in the reader's mind, and that image would therefore key a particular emotion. But an emotion which would be unique to the reader and not necessarily be the same emotion that was being conveyed by the author. So it's an interesting technique, and Eliot called this the objective correlative. A good example, for instance, is in his poem, The Journey of the Magi. There's a line in there where it says, "And an old white horse galloped away across the meadow." So there's a fragment of an image which doesn't really have anything to do with the sort of narrative of the poem or the storytelling in the poem, but everybody in reading that has an image in their mind. What is this mysterious old white horse which gallops away across the meadow? Just by saying that, you have a beautiful image in your mind. But what is that image? It comes loaded with lots of other things. Is this the white horse of a long forgotten king? Is it a white horse of a young child of innocence? What is this white horse? What does it represent? Why is it galloping away? Where is it going? And so the image itself is mysterious and sparks lots of emotion and lots of thought and pondering in your mind.
So they were aiming to be evocative of something that is sort of using the person's own experience and memories as almost raw materials. This makes a lot of sense from what I've read and also from maybe a possible connection with Lewis. So we read Proof Rock from end to end. I'm currently going through the 4 quartets. Yeah, in Proof Rock, it's often I describe it as either setting a scene or you getting a glance at something.
Yeah, it's very visual. And he's throwing, if you like, lots of fragments and images out there. And he does it with his use of language as well as his use of imagery. So he'll throw in little quotations from classic literature, little quotations in a foreign language, which he's throwing into the poem almost as if you're overhearing this conversation in a French cafe or in a German restaurant. And you hear these little snippets of conversation. Maybe it's a little bit of conversation of some Cockney women in a pub in East London. But these little snippets of conversation, along with the imagery and along with the language, combine to create a feeling or an image or an emotion within your mind and within your imagination.
And that connects with what I was saying about a possible connection with Lewis, because I've always described Lewis as evocative in his writing, and he seems to manage to, draw a picture with the fewest lines, and your brain just seems to fill in so much more. I just read my 3.5-year-old son. I read him The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I read through the battle scene. And I remember when I reread that for the first time as an adult, I had remembered it being so much longer. But I think that was because of what Lewis is able to do. The amount of heavy lifting he's able to do with so few words. So it seems that this was something in the water at the time.
Yeah, and Lewis is also a very imaginative and very evocative. It's a good word, evocative writer. But his is always within the narrative that he's telling.
Yes,
Whereas
much more
Eliot,
comprehensible.
yeah, and you can understand and appreciate. Eliot is using the imagery for its own sake in trying to produce the thought, trying to produce the emotion that accompanies it. So where Lewis uses the image of Aslan, the great lion, Eliot might simply throw a lion into the middle of a poem in an evocative way in order to evoke the emotion that you have associated with a lion, the king of the beasts.
Yeah. Oh, this is great. This is always what I hope it happens on these Jack's Bookshelf episodes, as I dive into an author I've never touched before, and I'm often quite confused. It's nice when things start to connect up a little bit. But I suppose that the big question is, what makes Eliot an important author?
I think he's important because he's at the forefront of the whole cultural movement at the first half of the 20th century in Europe. Here's Europe reeling from 2 world wars, and Eliot is really kind of the spokesman of the age. He's speaking in a modernistic idiom. He's speaking to the modernistic angst in the society at the time, but he's also offering a Christian solution. The Wasteland is very much the result of his own breakdown, his own disastrous marriage, and his own inner angst, which reflects the whole tension and anxiety in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. But Eliot goes on to become a Christian, and he finally, after the Second World War, writes the 4 quartets, which, along with, in my opinion, along with Dante's Divine Comedy, is the zenith of Christian poetry, all Christian poetry. It's deeply contemplative, it's deeply philosophical, and it's deeply beautiful. And so Eliot, therefore, speaks in the 20th century through English poetry to the modern age. And he not only dissects and analyzes the modern age with The Wasteland, which is a very bleak and very pessimistic analysis, but he goes on through his middle poetry and the 4 quartets to actually offer a Christian solution.
Now, you've mentioned the 4 quartets, the love song of Alfred Prufrock, and The Wasteland. So let's actually focus in on his corpus. First of all, did he only write poetry or just mostly write poetry? Because that's all I know him from.
Yeah. His poetry is what he's best known for. I should say that between The Wasteland, his great work, The Wasteland, and his greater work, The 4 Quartets, there's a middle body of work which might be considered his conversion poetry. After 1927, he begins writing explicitly Christian poetry, and there you will find the poem Ash Wednesday, Journey of the Magi, Marina, and various other sort of middle poems in which he's really finding his Christian voice. But he was also well known as a literary critic. He ran a literary critical magazine. He was the editor of that, and also he was known as an eminent literary critic, commenting on Shakespeare and other classical writers. And then in his later years, he went on to be a dramatist. He really was trying to communicate to a wider audience, and he realized that a lot of his poetry was inaccessible to the ordinary person. And so he began to write plays which were produced in the West End of London. They're very dated now, but he tried to write them for a contemporary audience. And he tried to write, admirably, he tried to write in verse drama for a popular audience. And I think in his day, when they were produced in the West End, they were actually fairly successful commercially. So he did reach a wider audience. They're not performed now very much because they're dated both in style and in language. But I think he did actually succeed in with his drama in reaching a wider audience in that way.
Mm-hmm. And so his major works, Four Quartets, The Wasteland, Proof Rock. Are there any others that we should be mentioning?
I think if anybody's being introduced to Eliot, they should begin with the love song of J. Alpha Prufrock and The Wasteland, but make sure that you read it with some notes because it is rather dense.
Yes.
And it is confusing. You can't just sit down and read it from the beginning. However, I can remember a friend of mine who went on to be an English professor, and after we had graduated from college, and he went his way and I went mine, we met some years later, and he said to me, "Okay," he said, "let's sit down and talk." He said, "Tell me about Eliot because I really don't get it at all." And I said, "You're an English professor. You're supposed to be teaching the guy, you know." So, but I said to him, "Look, just read the poetry and accept the language for what it is right there and how it makes you feel and what it makes you think. It's not, he's not trying to tell you a story. He's not trying to give you a message. He's trying to get you to engage with this imagery. Okay. It's a bit like going and seeing modern art and you stand in front of it and say, what is it supposed to be? And that's the wrong question. You're supposed to say, how does it make you feel? Okay, so it's very much a subjective kind of thing, but I believe it is accessible. If you simply go in and say, what is this image doing to me? What am I seeing here? What am I feeling here? Then most people can actually begin to get it.
I think that's fantastic advice because I definitely fall into the former by default, and it's taken me a long time to get a little bit better at doing the latter.
And persevere. You know, if you read Dante's Divine Comedy, you need to read it with some good notes, like the notes of Dorothy Sayers or Anthony Esolen, so that you're understanding the references and so forth in there that you can't possibly understand yourself because you're separated by several centuries. It's like that with Eliot. Read it with some good notes, do a little bit of background work and background reading. Some of my essays, which are there at the Imaginative Conservative website, I've written a fair bit on Eliot. And in my book that we're referencing, Reluctant Allies, there's a whole section on Eliot and his poetry, which helps to explicate and explain a lot of the poetry.
I would also say, though, that even as you're reading it and not really understanding what's going on, you can still also delight in some very lovely turns of phrase. I remember in the opening poem, my wife and I, we quoted this line to each other, let's just say several times a day, when Eliot writes, "And would it have been worth it after all, after the cups, the marmalade, the tea, among the porcelain, among some talk of you and me?" That was something that we repeated to each other pretty much every time we were putting the kettle on.
Talking about the polite ladies in Boston, he says they have measured out their life in coffee spoons.
Yeah. So I would encourage people, yes, persevere, but also just enjoy some of the language, because that was the main thing I think that I took away from Proof Rock, that he's got a wonderful way with language, and it's definitely very image centered. You're left with images at the end of each of the poems, even if you haven't quite understood what's happening or why.
Yeah, and also there is a storyline that runs through Proof Rock. He's this nervous young man who's going to a society party, and he's cynical about the whole thing. And actually, Proof Rock is a very satirical poem. It satirizes this polite Tea Party society of Harvard and New England that Eliot was part of. There's that line where he says, "Do I dare to eat a peach? Do I dare to walk along the beach? I shall wear my white flannel trousers rolled." And he has all these specific details, which always makes things come to life.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you would recommend Proof Rock to be the first place, and then The Wasteland?
Yeah. For The Wasteland, again, read it with some notes and try to pick up the images. The clue to The Wasteland is there in the end of the first section where he says, "I have gathered together these scattered images." No, these scattered fragments, he says. And that's what he's done in The Wasteland. The Wasteland was actually written after he had a nervous breakdown. And he said later, he dismissed The Wasteland and said later it was the product of a diseased mind. So he didn't have much time for it, but it still is a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece of modern poetry in which he gathers together these fragments. And remember, this is written, I believe, right after the First World War, when Europe is it's a scattered fragments of a broken society, and The Wasteland reflects that.
And Regarding notes, is there a particular brand of notes that you recommend? Or just people should just use whatever they can find?
The internet is a wonderful resource. I would go in there and check out, just type in, how can I understand Eliot's Wasteland? There are probably umpteen articles will come up which will help you.
Yes. When we were doing Proofrock, my wife and I, we would read like one of the poems, talk about it, try and reach some consensus as to what we thought it was about, or sometimes sharp disagreement, and then we would Google to try and find out who was closest. Wonderful. Okay, so those are his major works. Let's come to the question for this podcast, which is his connection and relationship with Lewis. So what was their relationship over the course of their lives, and how would you say they influenced each other?
Remember, they're almost exact contemporaries. Well, not exact. I think, if I remember, I think Eliot's a little bit older, but there was a definite sort of animosity between them. Lewis is the Britisher, Eliot is the American, so there's a kind of tension there to start with. But most of all, Lewis is very much wedded to traditional English poetry. He is an expert, of course, in Renaissance English literature. He is trying his own hand at writing poetry in a traditional, conventional, romantic style. But Lewis's attempts to be a poet are unsuccessful. And so there's a natural sort of animosity there between Lewis and Eliot, because Eliot comes along as this upstart American, and he writes this iconoclastic modernist verse, and Lewis is wedded, as I say, to the old style, the conventional style, poetry that rhymes, poetry that makes sense, poetry that means something, and he regards Eliot's poetry as dismal. And in fact, Lewis writes a satirical poem which begins something like, "For the life of me, I have never been able to see how the evening sky looks like a patient etherized upon a table," which is, of course, the opening lines to the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And Lewis also went on to, because he was a literary critic, and he went on to criticize Eliot's literary criticism. And he and his friends submitted some spoof articles to Eliot's journal, trying to get them published, written in a modernist style, satirizing the modernists. And Eliot was smart enough to sniff out a hoax and didn't publish them. So this rivalry continued on until finally, in their later years, they met in Oxford and they had a cordial meeting, and they became friends because they realized that the things which held them together, which was their commitment to their Christianity and their commitment to a conservative Christianity, was greater than the disagreements they had about literary style. So they became friends in the end, and they worked together on the revision of the Psalms for the Anglican Church, which was taking place in the early 1960s. That's why I called my book "Reluctant Allies," because they were allies, but they were reluctant to be so.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a perfect transition point. Let's talk specifically about your book. Would you mind just talking us through the broad areas that you address in this book?
Yeah, I had been writing a column for the St. Austin Review, which is a literary journal published by my friend Joseph Pierce, and the regular column is called the Inklings. So every other month, whenever the journal is published, he gives us a theme to write on. And I try to link it in with the Inklings in some way, link it in with C.S. Lewis or Tolkien or Eliot. Eliot wasn't one of the Inklings, but I've included him as part of that literary set. And so I then gathered these essays together and categorized them according to those different authors, Tolkien, Lewis, and Eliot, basically, and subcategorized them, especially with Lewis, thematically. So there's a section on Lewis as philosopher, section on Lewis as an apologist, section on Lewis as a fantasy writer, and likewise with Eliot, tried to categorize them thematically and chronologically. So there's sections on Eliot, sections on Lewis, and a nice section on Tolkien as well.
And as you talk about the four quartets, you've got several articles relating to that. Listening to Burnt Notion, East Coker, Dry Salvages, and Little Gidding. What do you talk about that?
Yeah, the four quartets were first envisioned by Eliot Well, first of all, he wrote Bert Norton, which was the first of the four quartets, and he did not envision there being any more poems. But he then goes on to be inspired to write East Coker, which is the second one, and then the Dry Sauvages, which is the third, before going on to Little Gidding, which is the final one. He then began to see that there was a unity to these four poems that were being written, and he began to consciously develop them into the four quartets. And the four quartets are basically a meditation written after the Second World War. No, actually, some of it during the Second World War and after the Second World War, a reflection on life, on time, on the meaning of history, and the individual's connection with history through prayer and through faith. And they're deeply contemplative, drawing on that earlier reading I was talking about, in which he was reading into the English mystics. It's interesting that in Little Gidding, at the very end, he references Julian of Norwich, who's one of the most important of the 14th century English mystics. And all through the four quartets, he is really expressing his life as a contemplative man. What had happened in his life personally was he made a very disastrous marriage when he was a young man and first living in England. His wife, Vivian, eventually lost her mind and had to be consigned to an asylum. And Eliot felt terribly guilty about this, that he had to separate from his wife. And he lived for about 20 years as a single, celibate, reclusive, almost an eremitical kind of life, very devoted to prayer, very devoted to his Christian life, very devoted to his spirituality. And it's out of this crucible of suffering that his four quartets actually blossom.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's beautiful. You mentioned that they were both involved in literary criticism, Eliot and Lewis. How did their philosophy with regards to literary criticism, how similar was it?
You got me there. Well, I know a lot about Eliot and Lewis. I'm not that familiar with their differences in literary criticism, but I can guess Lewis's criticism is going to be conditioned very much by his commitment to the classics and commitment to conventional forms of literary expression, whereas Eliot is going to be coming at the same works, but with that modern eye and that modern sensibility that he had. And analyzing it according to subjective emotions that are being transacted rather than the objectivity of the work itself.
I did find it funny there when you were talking about Eliot's love and connection to Lady Julian of Norwich, because she was one of Lewis's great loves as well. It's just kind of funny that two men who have such similar interests managed to be at loggerheads for at least a good portion of their life. Lewis said that Owen Barfield was his second friend, the man who has read all of the right books and got the wrong thing out of them.
Yeah.
I think Eliot could have fulfilled that if Barfield hadn't been available.
Probably so. It is gratifying that they became friends at the end of their life and they began to see eye to eye on the most important things. And that's what we're concerned about, and why I think I was attracted to both of them so much, and how they've been such a great influence on my own life.
Well, Father Dwight Longenecker, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for the invitation.
You're very welcome. And as we wrap up, can you please tell us where people can go to find out more about you and pick up your books?
Yeah, a lot of my writing is available at the Imaginative Conservative website, but also people can go to my blog and my website, which is dwightlongenecker.com. They can go there to follow my blog, which is free, but there's also some audio content and some video content and my bookstore, so they can go and explore there and find some more of my ideas and some more of my writing.
Great. Do you have any books in the pipeline?
I'm actually working on a book called Bloodshed and Blessing, which is an exploration of the practice and the meaning of blood sacrifice down through history and how that connects with our Lord's sacrifice on the cross and ultimately in the representation of that sacrifice in the Mass.
Great stuff. All of your books have wonderful titles. I actually stole Immortal Combat for the title of one of our episodes, but I will freely admit here that it was the title of one of your books that I just thought was really cool.
Good. I'm also writing a fair bit of drama, as I move towards retirement, I've got some more free time. I'm writing drama and fiction. I've completed a novel and a couple of stage plays, and I'm working on a few more.
Wonderful. Well, please keep us posted, and I'll keep an eye on your website.
Thank you.
I hear the call for final drinks, so thanks to our intern Julia and our sound engineers Taylor and Sarah and our patron supporters, particularly our top tier supporters, Dan, Jody, Robert, Mark, Rowdy, Angela, David, Peter, Kate, James, John, Sarah, Rebecca, Megan, Brian, Joanna, Kelly, Stephen, Gary, Paul, Kay, Becca, Shane, Thomas, Amanda, Joelle, Erica, Matt, James, Bud, Aldo, Kevin, and Mark. And of course, all of you for listening. All of us co-hosts, we pray every single time we release an episode for your blessing. And if you've enjoyed this episode, if it has been a blessing to you, we'd ask you to join us again next time, when we'll be going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.